In continuing the tradition of institutionalizing prestige linguistic varieties, it had the consequence of contrasting non-prestige regional varieties as linguistically inferior, a status that also applied to speakers of those varieties. And once dialect writing made its way to America, becoming popular in the early to mid-19th century, it began to reflect attempts to democratize the literature in ways that can be identified as distinctly American, including by way of its rebellion against more genteel literary forms that had been popular early in the 19th century, and especially in Europe. The rise of 19th century American dialect humor, usually known as the Old Southwestern tradition, and in the old days, the Old Southwest was Alabama. It correlates with the decline of the Southern frontier, a frequent setting for the pre-Civil War dialect humor, and also to the rise of the Jacksonian common man, and it always was a man, never a woman. This common man, often a Southerner like Jackson himself, represented a challenge to the political power of the educated elite. It's no coincidence that minstrelsy also established itself at this time as part of the rebellion against elite and European-style culture and the development of uniquely American literature and theater. Dialect functions as a defining element for such popular or lowbrow entertainment in these new American genres. Some critics have argued that the representation of black speech by white authors during the last decades of the 19th century came out of the agitated reaction of some Southern whites to radical shifts in the social order resulting from emancipation. This seems especially plausible with respect to the kind of politically motivated use of dialect that helped to define the plantation tradition, an offshoot of the post-Civil War local color movement that capitalized on nostalgia for disappearing ways of life and emphasized nostalgia for slavery. In other words, it's the literary analog of minstrelsy. The representations of black dialect that helped to define the plantation tradition, along with the dialect performed in minstrel shows, emphasized the distance between the African-American characters and the predominantly white audience, and established a set of stereotypical linguistic conventions for literary and theatrical performances of black speech. For many in that white audience, the conventions were accepted as realistic as well as symptomatic of black inferiority in their minds, and those effects proved persistent, so much so that many black writers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries consciously avoided representing dialectal speech in their work, with a few notable exceptions like Charles Chesnutt, Paul Dunbar, and later Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes, Sterling Brown, and a few other Harlem Renaissance writers of the 1920s and 30s. A somewhat but not entirely analogous situation developed with respect to representations of white Southern speech, which within the Old Southwestern humor tradition had begun to develop conventions of its own. Initially, this white vernacular was deployed in part to emphasize distance between the dialect speakers and the standard-speaking frame narrator, which reproduced and reinforced the distance between the dialect-speaking characters and the presumably standard white audience as well. However, this version of Southern white vernacular was not constructed entirely to maintain class and regional distance. As Cohen and Dillingham point out in their book Humor of the Old Southwest, the white frontier characters were also celebrated. In other words, there was an element of narrative admiration for their common man qualities and frontier masculinity, with which their dialect is associated. And this clearly was not the case for the literary and theatrical constructions of black speech and identity. However, the conventions and stereotypes surrounding these rural white characters and their speech have persisted into the age of electronic media and have over the years lost much of that element of admiration. But more about that in a minute. By the 1930s, no longer were books and minstrel shows the main sources of fictional representations of speech and projections of identity. Film was reaching huge audiences, and television would also become enormously influential in the coming decades. Probably the most important film of the 1930s in terms of the intersections between media, performance, ethnicity, and the South was Gone with the Wind, which premiered in December 1939. The film was controversial from its earliest days of pre-production, and race, region, and dialect were all implicated. African-American scholars and activists had major reservations about Margaret Mitchell's novel and described in a series of news articles in the black press and in letters to producer David O. Selznick how the novel perpetuated the worst stereotypes about African Americans, depicting slaves content with plantation life, just as they'd been portrayed in minstrelsy, and with those not under white supervision portrayed in Margaret Mitchell's own words as, quote, black apes who committed outrages on women, end quote. As casting and production began, the filmmakers considered a Southern black dialect a critical component of the representation of the black characters, and Susan Myrick was hired as the dialect coach for the African-American actors cast in the film. Myrick, who was white and who also worked as a reporter for the Macon Telegraph, felt strongly that the authenticity of the black characters and their speech was key to recreating a realistic pre-war South for the film. She wrote that she planned to coach the actors to speak in the style of, quote, the middle Georgia Negro of before the war days, end quote. It seems interesting that a white dialect coach was hired to teach black actors how to talk black. And so one question is whether Myrick's mission was to recreate authentic speech or whether the goal was to reproduce the conventionalized speech of minstrelsy, a black dialect that a white audience would understand as black and accept as authentic, even though it had to be taught to black actors by a white person, thus capitalizing on the legacy of blackface minstrelsy. Dialect and other performance issues were also controversial for the white Southern characters in the film. The film's original director, George Cukor, and star Clark Gable clashed over how Southern the Ohio-born Gable's dialect should be, with Cukor asking for a, quote, more distinct accent, end quote, for the character of Rhett Butler than Gable wanted to do. The matter was decided by producer David Selznick, who agreed that Gable could have his way and use a more subtle accent. Some observers might argue that the Charleston, South Carolina-born Rhett's accent is so subtle as not to exist at all. I think he tried to go Arliss once or twice. Casting Scarlett was also controversial, taking many months and involving extensive travel, especially around the South. Selznick's representatives invaded the South, to use their words, at the invitation of Southern colleges, mayors, junior league presidents, and even the governor of Georgia, interviewing and auditioning hundreds of young women. Unfortunately, no suitable Scarlett was found during these Southern trips, and the film project was criticized by observers who called the Southern auditions a stunt. When Vivian Lee was selected, Selznick and his staff received so much mail protesting the choice of a non-Southerner, and a Brit to boot, that the publicity department had to place stories and biographies in newspapers and magazines all over the country to try to sway popular opinion. When Lee first auditioned for Cukor, he had been put off by her British accent. She began working with Susan Myrick, and according to some observers, within a few days she mastered the Southern accent. Other observers might feel differently. Lee was not the only Brit to play a Southerner in Gone with the Wind. Co-stars Olivia de Havilland and Leslie Howard were also English, with Clark Gable the only American among the film's white leads. Producers and audiences must have found Lee convincingly Southern, because in 1951 she was cast in her second most famous role, Blanche Dubois in The Streetcar Named Desire. Given Susan Myrick's apparent goal of teaching black actors to talk black according to popular white images of black speech, the casting of the film's white characters raises the question of whether real Southerners were too Southern for Gone with the Wind. That is, did actual Southerners conflict with the idealized images that the film was trying to perpetuate? That idealization of the antebellum South is obviously one of the major stereotypes of performed white Southernness, but I think an equally powerful image is the one established in the old Southwestern humor tradition, which continued to dominate public performances of white Southern identity well into the 20th century. With the exceptions of the Ewings of Dallas, Matlock, Designing Women, and a few others, white Southerners continue to be portrayed as nearly exclusively working class, rural, uneducated, and unsophisticated. And there's evidence out there that this is just the way some members of the viewing audience liked it. For example, in a review of the 1967 film In the Heat of the Night, the celebrated critic Bosley Crowther seems to relish the villainy of the white characters, referring to them as, quote, snarling rednecks with layers of ignorance and prejudice in an ugly little Mississippi town, end quote. Despite the complexity of this film and its performances, then, one effect is that the rural South is represented as the nucleus for racism and ignorance, which might have been a comforting thought to some white audiences outside the South when the film was released in 1967 at the height of the Civil Rights era. Columnist Thomas Lakeman, a white native of Alabama, argues that recognizably Southern speech features conjure up images that, quote, no one above the Mason-Dixon line is going to find charming, end quote. Rather, he observes, quote, they're going to picture you at a tractor pull with mullet hair and a tank top and a forget how bumper sticker on your beat-up Ford pickup. You are from the moment you open your drawling mouth a cracker, end quote.